Jamie, you want to kick us off with a scenario?
Sure. Hello, everybody. Hello, Kelly. You know what? I'm going to give you a little bit, probably less personal examples, but more of anecdotal examples that I've heard from other providers. I have a feeling, and it's becoming pretty clear, that teams around the state, which includes county boards, family, individuals, providers, are struggling on the issue of specifically around visitation. It's becoming a real tough issue. Yes, there are providers who are scared to death about an individual going out and somehow contracting COVID, bringing it back into the home, the people they live with, who may be compromised, maybe not, but then you got that whole, all of a sudden you have a house that's infected and all the things that go with that. As a provider, I'm telling you, as soon as someone has COVID in a home, I've been through it, staff bail. They bail. So I know we shouldn't consider that, but that's a reality. So providers, I think for the most part, are struggling when it comes to what do we do with visitation. County boards, I'll let Jen talk, but I'm hearing too, they're struggling with rights and the ability to live a life and all those kinds of things which they should be bringing up. And so you have the two come together, trying to compromise, trying to find a way for someone to go do something. And that's where the conflict comes in. And without, there are 88 different ways of handling that team decision, like a lot of things. So here's a scenario that I want to throw out that I've heard, but I think it's pretty reflective of a lot of providers. And that is, you got Jack, Jim, and John who live together in a 3-bedroom apartment, 3-bedroom house. The Jack and Jim are both compromised, and the other guy, who I can't remember now his name, Fred, let's call him again. Fred has a family, very active family. He's been away from his family for 6 months, only talked to by phone. A wedding's coming up, and they want Fred to go to the wedding. There's going to be a couple hundred people there at the wedding. There's a chance that Fred could there's no guarantee that the wedding's going to be safe. So in that scenario, all of us want Fred to go to the wedding, of course. But the situation comes up, what about his roommates? Do they have any rights?
Can you add, Jamie, that one of his roommates has a guardian who's adamantly against this other roommate going? Because that's another piece that takes those conversations as well.
Perfect. So let's add that guardian there, because that's real, that happens. So, I think it's fine, and I really do applaud and push that these decisions should be made locally. But here's the problem. There are some skillful people on the county side and the provider side. A lot of us can handle those kind of discussions and come up with something in a lot of times. But there's a lot of providers that aren't skilled in this area. There's a lot of county board SSAs that aren't skilled in this area. So the problem comes in with how do you solve that problem? And not that everybody agrees, but everyone walks away saying we came up with a good solution here that we're comfortable with. We're not seeing a lot of comfortable solutions in those scenarios. Jen, you want to add on to that?
No, I think that's a great scenario. People have very strong feelings one way or another, and I know we can't rule ourselves to death here and come up with a rule, but in the absence of guidance, with the guidance being just discuss it in the team process, what happens is, particularly SSAs who feel strongly one way or another, they're really struggling with how to help the team through this, and sometimes without guidance, sometimes their personal feelings are coming out, and because they're human like everybody else, and So the provider has their own feelings, so does the family, so does the SSA. And so I think it is a struggle with where do we go with that? And we as the county board are there in the middle trying to facilitate that conversation. And I think sometimes, like you said, we're doing a really good job and there's good outcomes. But I think often we're not doing a great job, and we're hearing from our provider community that they want more from us, which I feel like we need to do, but I'm not real sure where we go from here.
The last thing I'll add to that, Kelly, because I know you're going to come up with a wonderful answer or an insight, is, keep in mind, providers and county boards are rule followers. You guys made us that way. So that's the way it is. That's the way our system is. And with the lack of rules, with the lack of consistent professional approach to tough situations like this, county boards are afraid of they're going to be dinged by making the wrong decision. Providers the same way. So add that on top of it, that anxiety of that, somehow doing something wrong.
Right. So a couple things. First of all, there is not going to be a rule that will be able to answer the questions, right? And this is something that no one has ever dealt with before. We certainly have rules on the books around rights restrictions, all of those kinds of things that everyone knows. I could say and tape it every day and say to the field, the department, our regulatory unit is not interested in issuing citations and, causing problems for boards or providers. It does not mean that we wouldn't reach out and have discussions, but I think what's different about this situation is that there's not always an answer. And what's the weird parts of the conversation are individual service planning is one thing. Now we're talking about groups of people planning, right? And that's not something that we've had to really worry about in the past. If I was able to do something and my two roommates weren't, well, then they just were not able to, but I still could. And this pandemic has changed that, which is, really different. So to have a consistent approach, I don't know that we're going to have a consistent approach other than we make sure that we educate people and their guardians about the risks of engaging in certain activities, right? We make sure that we're, complying with mandates or CDC guidance, right? So really going to a wedding with 200 people in Ohio is really not in accordance with the guidelines right now. And so maybe that's something in this situation that, right, you can have a conversation with the family about, right? That, the governor's been clear about people being in places where there's 100 people or 200 people is not, not a good idea. Making sure that people understand that if you live with people who are medically compromised and you're not, is there another alternative for you? Is there somewhere else you could live? I mean, I know that's not as easy as just saying, well, then they should be able to move to wherever they want. And families need to understand that, as a provider, you have to worry about your staff and all the other people that you're serving. And that at some point, if they want to do something badly enough, you may not be able to provide services to them, whether that's something you really want to do or not. That might just be the answer. I mean, we're not going to issue in this situation, we would not be issuing citations to a provider or a county board around any of the decisions that are made, because I don't know that there's a right decision. I think it's just a, really crappy thing that's going on, and it's just not right or wrong. I think what we start getting involved and we start being a little annoying is when we hear of providers or county boards with these blanket statements, right? Where nobody's going to go, you live here and I'm worried about you and I'm worried about all the other residents and I'm worried about my staff and we're just not doing anything until this pandemic's over, right? That's the stuff that then gets our attention, where we start having to have conversations with you about that's not okay to do, right? That there's got to be some activities that people can participate in that minimize risk. So I don't know if that gives
Yeah.
you it.
Kelly, I think that's helpful because I think the reassurance around the citations is important for the field. And as far as I know, you haven't been issuing citations about any of these sorts of situations. You've been providing technical assistance is what I've understood.
Correct. And we have started to have a conversation about rights restrictions, right? We have, and we've had them when we run into situations where there are these big blanket statements,
Right.
where somebody's not, I am not going to allow you to go, right? Then and we're planning on sending something out around rights restrictions. Again, it's not going to answer every question. It's not going to be, super clear, because these are all real individualized situations.
I think that would be great for that to come out. And I think in that scenario we just talked through and your response, that is helpful. I think the question becomes though, where is the line drawn? So in that scenario that Jamie put out there, we've all had these discussions, we've referred to the CDC guidelines and what the governor said, and the family is just adamant, they are taking him to the wedding. The provider says, well then if you go, you can't come back and live here, or you have to quarantine somewhere for 14 days, because that's the kind of thing we're hearing. So then the question becomes, is that then a rights restriction of that person if the provider says you can't, and if you do, this is the consequence, or is it not? That's, I think, where we're getting stuck sometimes too.
I think it might be sometimes a rights restriction, right? I think it might. However, if I'm a provider and I get to decide whether or not I'm going to serve someone based on certain situations, I mean, that is their right to do. And so I think some of the providers who have been really diligent in saying, I don't care what you say, Kelly Miller, I'm not sending people out. And I'll take the rights restriction hit every day of the week.
Mhm.
I'm okay with that. Then I guess they are okay with that. I mean, I don't.
Yeah. I've heard that. And I will say one thing. I know, Kelly, you and I discussed several months ago, and I think this is a good distinction to make here between Jamie's scenario, the 200-person wedding,
Right.
versus a scenario where you and I talked about someone we know, a birthday party, an outdoor birthday party where there were going to be like 10 or 11 people, and it was
Right.
going to be outdoors, and it was all family and not anyone, and everyone will be wearing a mask. That's such a distinction in my mind, and it goes back to all of this. The facts matter. The facts matter.
Can we shift gears? And I think this leads really well into this discussion, because I think the next problem area we're seeing is about visitors coming into homes. And again, we're mostly talking about not people who live on their own. That doesn't really come up. It's people who live with others. And I think there's two scenarios that come up. People who live, maybe that scenario of Jamie's, the 4 people or 3 people live together and they live in an apartment, a non-licensed apartment setting. And then there's also people who live together in congregate group settings where it's a licensed setting. And so in both scenarios, though, we are seeing some conflict when the provider is fearful, rightly so, understandably so, about who and what comes into those homes. But then the discussion becomes, well, are these 3 people, it's their home, so is it their decision, or how much does the provider have input into that? And does that scenario change when it's a licensed setting? Does it or doesn't it? I think that could be something we could issue some guidance on, just to help, because I think there's some confusion about, is it different or isn't it different between a typical, or what we might call supported living home versus a licensed home, and what role does the provider play in both?
Right. So the only thing for me, just not doing a lot of thinking before talking, which is sort of what I do, I want to quickly say it is not different, right? It should not be different. However, a provider in a licensed setting, you don't get to pick a different provider, right? That's the only difference. So if you're coming into my home and I live with 2 other people, and I say, we want to have visitors, and so sorry that you don't feel comfortable with it, but we do, and that's what we want, the provider certainly has the ability to say, then I don't feel comfortable providing services. I don't feel like I can ensure, your health, and therefore I'm out. I'm going to give you notice. The only difference between that and a licensed facility is a licensed facility doesn't say that, right? You have to leave, not the other way around. That, in my opinion, is the only thing that's different. It still has to be about people, and not just people with disabilities, but people who are coming into that home, providers, right? The SSA, it's all, I feel like we should make sure we keep it be the same conversation, because we could go off the deep end and have all kinds of different conversations about the licensure rules, but I really beg you not to make me go there because I don't want to.
That's fair. That's fair. I mean, the reality is they're all in home and community-based services settings.
Correct.
I think the point, though, of your scenario, Lori, is it can be applied in this situation too. I think providers, and I know we've done it and it's worked, you make accommodations. And so if a family wants to visit Fred in a licensed facility, and there's 4 other people living there, some of them are compromised, so you make especially during the summer, it was easy. You make a nice area in the backyard or whatever, the garage sometimes, for people to visit privately. Do you prefer that they all wear masks,
Yep.
just like all the staff are?
Exactly.
You know,
Right.
things like that, but it can be done. I don't know, you're right though, Kelly, not everybody thinks that way. And that's part of the problem, some of the tension I imagine that we're hearing around the state. This conversation we're having here right now is the ideal epitome of what teams are having conversations all around the state. They're worried about holidays. They're worried about these issues. They're worried about how far can we use health and safety. Providers are scared to death because we know if those folks contract COVID, we're the ones responsible.
Right.
But there's also a fine line of we can't keep people in a bubble either forever. That's not our job. So, you know, if you think it's a good idea that providers and county boards should solve these issues through the team process locally, then maybe the local team, meaning the county board and providers, should come up with some guidelines that aren't new, but they're guidelines that are already out there, bring them together that make sense for SSAs and make sense for providers, and we're all working off the same sheet.
Right. Yep. And we have people at different levels of abilities to communicate, right? And so I think if you know you're struggling, if you know that there's a SSA that's really good SSA in lots of ways, but communication might not be their strength, then I think they need extra help. And you need to be able to run through scenarios with people, because I think if you just let people know that you have some empathy and that there's some understanding that this is so hard and that there's not a right or wrong answer, that in and of itself should make people feel more comfortable as you can feel it in a time like this. But yes, I mean, I think about the holidays also, and I think this probably is a perfect time to start having discussions between boards and providers. I know that there's lots of those meetings that happen naturally anyway, about having a discussion about what are we all kind of comfortable with, and then what's the process for those things that people are asking that are not at all comfortable, that we're not comfortable with, and what are the alternatives for people.
Yeah, because I'd also tell you from a provider standpoint, yeah, I know that I always have in the back of my pocket when we're not going to serve you anymore. That's the last thing I want to do.
Of course.
And it's the last thing a county board wants to do, because there are providers who are saying, we're not taking anybody on during the pandemic.
Right.
So then you got somebody who can't be served somewhere.
Right.
So it should always be the final last resort. And I think we could do better in between to try to compromise and come up with something, because, SSAs want something to go by. They don't want to make it up. Providers want something to go by.
Right.
Kelly, what if, I don't want to put you on the spot with this question, but is what are the top 3 things that you want teams to take away from this discussion, or when you look at the world, when you hear these scenarios, and I mean, people are, I'm sure, talking to you every day about this stuff. What are the top 3, 5, 2, whatever you want to be, things you want teams to consider in this?
I think that I want to feel like people are having real conversations with individuals and their families, right? Real ones, and not just have a decision made prior to the discussion. I think that happens all the time. And I mean, I think that's when families get so irritated. Certainly there are those outliers that you're not going to make happen, right? That's not who we're talking about. But generally speaking, acknowledging what people are asking for, asking lots of questions about it, right? The kinds of things that Lori talked about with the holidays, right? Just don't think that we're going to be able to have 30 people, right? We just don't think it's a great idea for Kelly to be participating in an event where there's 50 people, right? Because we don't know that all 50 people are going to wear the masks. Really getting to know people. So listening, I think, is the biggest thing. Making sure that people understand that you can't force someone to stay home, right? You can't, but you can do something different when they want to come back, and being super honest about that. Those aren't 4 or 5 or 3 or 4, and I don't know that that was even one answer, but I mean, those are the things I think are the most important. I think it's the thing that worries me when you started talking about guidelines and 88 different ones, or however many, is that it really does need to be individually driven, and the circumstances change the answer every time.
So it would seem reasonable that sort of conversation guide, as we move into holidays and all that, is the same sort of thing, which is the first thing is, if the person asks, what is it they're asking for? Next, you said educate them and their feelings on what that all means. What is it they're asking for? What does that mean? Ask a question, is it legal? Does it violate some regulation or law or anything, or order? And then once you get through that, then the questions are about what are the facts, right? How big a group is it? Who's going to be there? Where is it going to be? Is it inside or out? Is it, all those kinds of things. Will people be wearing masks? Get into all the details of the facts. And then before making an answer, before making a final decision, is there any possible way this could occur? And as Jamie described, accommodations or other ways that it could still happen, but maybe not exactly what the person asked for. And that's sort of a conversation tree or decision tree. Yeah, that makes good sense.
I think, and we can wrap this up here soon. I will be respectful of your time, but I think the last point that was made is probably the most important. That it's okay to feel uncomfortable about these conversations. It's completely okay. We've never been down this road before, but we still have to have the conversation, and we still have to work our way through and try to figure things out. And you're going to feel weird the whole time you're doing it, but it's something we have to do. And I think that's a great point. And giving people permission to feel uncomfortable, I think, is a great point.